The law was only a few pages, but it hit like an earthquake. Ibrahim Traore signed it without ceremony, no celebration, no victory speech, no smiling for cameras. Just a pen stroke that told every mining boardroom the same brutal truth. Burkina Faso will no longer be a raw material exit door. From now on, extraction would be tied to domestic processing. If a corporation wanted Burkina gold, manganese, or any strategic mineral, it wouldn't just dig it up and ship it out. It would build value inside the country: jobs, refining capacity, training, technology transfer, and a supply chain that feeds local industry first. Traore knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't just changing a policy, he was cutting profit margins at the source, and he could already feel the reaction forming like thunder behind the horizon. Lobby pressure, legal threats, media storms, and the soft diplomatic language that always arrives when someone's contract empire is threatened. He looked at the document and felt the deeper clarity settle in. This was the decisive moment, because for decades, the same story had repeated. Africa exports raw wealth and imports finished products at higher cost. The ground gets poorer, while the contracts get richer. Traore wasn't negotiating that story anymore. He was rewriting it. He set the pen down, eyes hard, and made a private promise that would turn this law into a line in the sand. Our resources will feed our people before they feed their shareholders. Traore understood the real profit in extraction isn't always in the digging. It's in the chain after the digging. The refining, the processing, the pricing power, the control of logistics and standards that decide who captures value and who stays dependent. So the resource sovereignty law was written to attack the chain, not just the mine. It required domestic processing commitments, clear timelines, measurable capacity, local labor thresholds, and enforceable penalties if companies failed to deliver. It demanded technology transfer as a condition of continued access. It prioritized local content in procurement and training, so the industry wouldn't remain an island staffed by foreigners while locals watched trucks drive wealth to the border. Traore didn't frame it as punishment. He framed it as basic logic. If you take from our ground, he told his advisors, you build in our land. He knew the immediate objection would be predictable. Processing takes time, costs more, requires infrastructure. Companies would say it's unrealistic. They would say the country isn't ready. They would say the market doesn't work that way. Traore heard those lines before he even heard them spoken. Because not ready is the oldest sentence used to justify permanent dependency. So he prepared the enforcement mechanism to be as important as the policy itself. No vague commitments, no endless feasibility studies, no promises that dissolve when headlines move on. This time, the state would measure delivery, and the moment the law became public, the reaction proved why it mattered. Boardrooms froze, not because they hated Burkina Faso, because the law threatened the structure they relied on. Export raw, refine elsewhere, keep the premium, leave the host country with crumbs and cleanup. Now the premium would have to be shared with Burkina workers and Burkina industry. That is what shook them. Within 24 hours, lobby contact began. Polite requests for clarification, private meetings offered as cooperation, draft amendments suggested as pragmatic improvements. It's not the stove. Traore read the proposals and felt the trap hidden in the language. They weren't asking to improve the law. They were asking to soften it until it stopped biting. Because a softened law is just paper. Then the legal threats began whispering. Arbitration, investor protections, international contract obligations. The system's message was clear. If you touch the value chain, we will drag you into courtrooms designed to protect whoever wrote the old rules. Traore anticipated it. He instructed legal teams to prepare a defense not based on emotion, but on legitimacy, public interest, national development objectives, and the country's right to structure its resource economy. But he knew courts weren't the only battlefield. Media was next. And media doesn't argue contracts. It argues character. He could already feel the labels loading up. Anti-market, authoritarian, reckless, dangerous, nationalist, labels designed to make the public fear the law before they understand it. Traore's response to that incoming storm was not a speech. It was a posture. He accelerated domestic planning, industrial zones, training pipelines, energy and transport upgrades because he refused to let the law be treated as fantasy. He wanted it to be seen as inevitability. And inevitability is what makes bargaining harder for corporations. Because you can negotiate with uncertainty. You can't negotiate with a country that has already decided. The backroom bargaining didn't come as open confrontation. It came as smiles. Executives requested partnership meetings. Envoys arrived with calm voices and thick folders. They spoke about jobs and development, but their eyes were on one thing: exemptions. A longer timeline, a softer penalty, a loophole for temporary export necessity, a pilot program that never becomes permanent. Traore listened and felt the pressure behind the politeness. They wanted him to believe the law was negotiable if they offered the right words. Then, they offered a more tempting currency than words. Deals, a refinery proposal with no binding deadlines, a training program with no guaranteed hiring, an investment package that sounded generous until you read the fine print and saw the same old structure: control of pricing, control of export routes, control of standards. Traore's anger stayed quiet, but it sharpened. He wasn't being offered development. He was being offered a new wrapper for the same dependency. And when the deals failed to soften him, the tone shifted. Not openly, but noticeably. Messages began hinting at consequences. Delays in planned investment, reassessment of operations, legal review, warnings, the subtle language that says, if you don't bend, we will make the environment uncomfortable. Traore recognized the move immediately. They were trying to turn the private economy into a hostage. If corporations slowed operations, the fiscal impact could spread into wages, local suppliers, and communities tied to mining. That discomfort could then be weaponized against Traore as proof the law was harmful. He refused to allow that hostage logic to work. He ordered continuity plans, alternative suppliers, domestic security stabilization, and interim processing arrangements with partners willing to operate under the new doctrine. He began building the next option, so the old option couldn't blackmail the country. And right on schedule, the media offensive arrived. International commentary called the law anti-market. Analysts warned it would kill investment. Headlines framed Traore as a man attacking business, rather than a leader restructuring value capture. Traore felt the psychological intent. Make processing sound like extremism, because if processing becomes normal, the raw export empire loses its easiest profits. So he counterframed it in one sentence, repeated through his government with discipline: we are not banning business. We are banning extraction without development. That line clarified everything. It separated investment from exploitation, and it forced the critics to reveal themselves, because anyone opposing local processing had to explain why a nation should stay permanently at the lowest rung of the value chain. Then came the quietest and most dangerous tactic: internal pressure. Domestic actors with ties to the old contracts began urging flexibility. Some warned about international consequences. Some argued the law should be delayed until conditions improve. They framed delay as wisdom. Traore heard the subtext and felt his resolve harden. Delay is how reforms die without being killed. So he pushed implementation forward with deadlines that could not be quietly moved. He demanded written commitments from companies. He established compliance audits. He made failure to build domestic value visible, measurable, and punishable. Because Traore understood the core truth of this moment. The battle wasn't about law. It was about who gets to define the future. A contract system built on raw export wanted to keep Burkina Faso as a supplier. Traore wanted Burkina Faso to become a producer. And producers don't beg for crumbs. They set terms. Once Traore made it clear the law wouldn't be softened, the counterstrike became operational. A few firms didn't shut down outright. That would look too obvious. Instead, they slowed. Permits suddenly needed review. Maintenance schedules expanded. New investment was paused, pending clarity. Suppliers were told to wait. Friction. The quiet kind that bleeds an economy without leaving fingerprints. Traore saw the pattern instantly. This wasn't business caution. It was bargaining by discomfort. Make the law feel expensive. So the leader retreats, and Traore knew the next step. If discomfort didn't work, lawfare. Threats of arbitration began circulating more loudly. Lawyers wrote letters that sounded polite but carried sharp intent, claims about investor protections, contract sanctity, international standards. Traore listened and felt the insult beneath the legal language. They spoke as if contracts were sacred, even when contracts were designed to keep the host country poor. So he responded with legal discipline, not emotion. He instructed his teams to review every concession agreement and identify irregularities, undervaluation clauses, exemption corridors, environmental liabilities, and stability provisions that protected corporate profit but not national development. If they wanted to fight in courtrooms, Traore wanted the world to see the full record of what those contracts had actually delivered. But while the legal battlefield warmed up, the media battlefield overheated. Panels began predicting catastrophe. Commentators claimed the law would cause mass layoffs. They framed Traore as reckless, as if demanding local processing were a personal whim rather than a development strategy used by many industrialized nations historically. Traore understood the emotional aim. Make workers fear the law, because if workers fear it, they will pressure him to retreat, turning the people into a weapon against their own future. So Traore moved to protect the most sensitive layer. Communities. He launched stabilization measures for mining regions, support for local suppliers, contingency wage protections, and rapid response logistics for essentials. He made sure the public felt the state's presence, not corporate absence. Then he addressed the country, not with slogans, but with a moral logic that was hard to argue with. If our minerals leave raw, he said, our children remain raw. He didn't mean uneducated. He meant unbuilt, no industry, no skills pipeline, no domestic value chain. He framed processing as a national dignity issue, not a business argument. Because business arguments can be drowned in expert noise. Dignity arguments travel, and as Traore's stance hardened, the corporate coalition's impatience grew. Some tried carrots, again bigger promises, larger packages, sudden offers of refineries. But the offers came with the same familiar disease. No enforceable timeline. Traore refused. He demanded commitments that could be measured because he knew a promise without a deadline is just delay, dressed as hope. Now the war moved into a sharper phase, not whether the law would stand, but whether the country could endure the pressure long enough for the law to become reality. Traore's strategy for endurance was simple and brutal. Remove blackmail. He knew corporations could only weaponize slowdowns if Burkina Faso had no alternative pathways. So, he accelerated the building of alternatives, domestic and external. He pushed interim processing partnerships with entities willing to operate under the new terms. He prioritized modular processing capacity that could be deployed faster than massive projects. He tightened export permissions so raw shipments couldn't quietly bypass the law under temporary necessity. And he did something most leaders fear because it invites confrontation. He made compliance public. Not every detail, but enough to create accountability. which firms signed binding commitments, which firms requested exemptions, which firms attempted delay tactics. Traore wanted the public to see the difference between investment and obstruction, because sunlight makes bargaining harder. Then he targeted the internal leakage problem that always weakens industrial policy: corruption and intermediaries. He knew that if the law created new procurement and infrastructure spending, opportunists would try to capture it, then blame industrialization when projects fail. So he enforced strict procurement discipline, oversight, and transparency windows. He refused to let industrialization become another theft corridor. The corporate coalition escalated again, this time with a more sophisticated pressure tool: international perception. They pushed the idea that Burkina Faso was an unreliable jurisdiction, that policy shifts were too sudden, that no investor could trust the state. Traore heard the intent: raise the cost of capital, raise insurance rates, and make development feel impossible. He countered with predictability: clear timelines, uniform standards, legal frameworks, consistent enforcement. Predictability is the oxygen investors actually need, not permissiveness. Traore also understood that the law's success required an emotional shift in the population. People had to see resources not as luck, but as responsibility. So he framed the value chain in everyday terms: why raw export keeps wages low, why processing creates skilled labor, why domestic production stabilizes the economy, why sovereignty is not a slogan, but a job. And slowly, the narrative began to split. Some voices still screamed anti-market, but inside Burkina Faso, more people began asking a different question: if our minerals are worth so much, why are we still importing everything expensive? That question is lethal to extractive systems, because once it becomes common, exploitation becomes harder to sell as normal business. Traore watched that shift and felt a rare kind of confidence. Not confidence in headlines, confidence in momentum. Because momentum is what turns laws into reality. Then the corporate coalition made its biggest move: a coordinated threat: arbitration plus slowdowns plus lobbying for diplomatic pressure stacked together, designed to overwhelm the state's capacity to respond. Traore didn't flinch. He stacked his response too. Legal defense teams were prepared, reserve buffers and continuity plans activated, alternative corridors strengthened, domestic communications disciplined. He treated it like a siege, and in a siege, the defender doesn't win by winning arguments. He wins by not collapsing. As the pressure stack failed to produce immediate retreat, Traore's leverage grew quietly, because every day he held the line, companies lost time and money. And time is the one thing shareholders don't forgive. Now the bargaining balance was shifting, not because the corporations suddenly became moral, but because the cost of resistance to the law was rising. Traore had turned endurance into leverage, and the final phase was coming. Would the nation convert this law into an industrial foundation that outlived the storm? When the pressure stack didn't force retreat, the attack shifted again, away from contracts and toward perception. The goal was no longer to defeat the law directly. The goal was to make the law financially lonely, to make banks hesitate, to make insurers inflate premiums, to make suppliers demand higher costs, to make partners quietly step back. Traore recognized the weapon immediately: the unreliable jurisdiction label. It's a soft sanction that doesn't require signatures. It spreads through memos and whispers. It turns development into a higher interest project. It makes industrialization feel unaffordable. And then, when projects struggle under inflated costs, the same voices claim, "See, it doesn't work." Traore felt the trap and refused it. He ordered a disciplined investment posture from the state: stable enforcement, clear rules, and predictable phases, so no one could claim the law was arbitrary. He wanted investors to understand something essential: this is not chaos. This is a new baseline. He also intensified the demonstration layer: visible progress that could not be denied. Training programs launched. Industrial zone groundwork began. Procurement for modular processing units accelerated. The state made sure people could physically see construction and capacity growing, because perception collapses when reality becomes visible. Meanwhile, media continued to frame Traore as anti-market. They emphasized the word force, as if requiring local processing were coercion. They ignored the decades of coercion embedded in the old model coercion. Through poverty, through raw export dependence, through contracts written with asymmetric power, Traore didn't waste time debating morality on their platforms. He debated with outcomes. He kept essential operations stable. He protected workers from being used as hostages. He prevented deliberate slowdowns from turning into community collapse. And he also countered the legal threat. He instructed the government to prepare a public interest defense framework, development mandates, national sovereignty, principles, and the right of a state to set industrial policy conditions for resource exploitation. If they wanted arbitration, Traore wanted the world to see the moral record of raw extraction without development. But beneath the formal battles, the most dangerous fight was happening in private rooms. Domestic elites, some tied to old contracts, began urging compromise. They warned of international consequences. They pushed for phased exemptions and pilot periods that would quietly dilute enforcement. Traore heard the familiar scent of surrender, disguised as prudence. He refused. He understood what they wanted. Keep the old value chain alive long enough for everyone to forget why the law existed. So he pushed the opposite. He made the law harder to forget. He made compliance deadlines public. He made exemptions rare and punishable. He made non-compliance visible, because the only way to kill an extraction empire is to remove its favorite habitat. Negotiable enforcement. Traore was building something the old system couldn't easily bargain with, a permanent expectation that value must stay. As the weeks passed, the corporate coalition faced a problem it couldn't solve with lawyers or headlines. Traore wasn't blinking, and when a leader doesn't blink, the pressure machine begins to expose its real face. The soft threats become sharper. The polite meetings become colder. The concern starts sounding like punishment. Traore watched the temperature change and felt the deeper truth confirm itself. They never feared the law as paper. They feared the law as precedent. Because if Burkina Faso could require domestic processing and survive, then other countries would ask the same question. Why are we exporting raw and importing expensive? That question spreads faster than ideology. So the system escalated with a familiar tactic, whispering about internal instability, the idea that Traore was pushing too hard, that the country was becoming difficult, that leadership might face pressure if it continued. Traore recognized the threat as a strategic warning. If you won't be controlled by contracts, you'll be controlled by consequences. He responded with two moves, one external, one internal. Externally, he strengthened alternative partnerships and supply chains to reduce dependence on any single corporate cluster. He made the country harder to isolate. Internally, he hardened the state's posture against capture. Anti-corruption oversight on industrial spending, security monitoring against sabotage, and protection for officials and technocrats implementing the law. Because he knew how reform fails, not always from foreign pressure, but from internal leakage. If the new processing projects were captured by corrupt intermediaries, opponents could point to failures and say industrialization is a scam. Traore refused to give them that ammunition. Then, he made his most dangerous political move. He framed the law as a national line, not a personal project. He spoke to the public as if speaking to history, calm, unembellished, uncompromising. This is not against investors, he said. This is against permanent extraction. That sentence stripped away the fog. It forced everyone to choose their side without hiding behind technicalities. And once a nation begins choosing openly, bargaining becomes harder, because the old game depends on ambiguity. It depends on elites negotiating in private while citizens remain confused. Traore was killing ambiguity. The corporate coalition tried one last angle, offering a grand package, a large, flashy promise of investment in exchange for flexibility. The proposal sounded impressive until you looked closer and saw the same familiar poison. Control. Control of pricing. Control of export routes. Control of standards. Control of ownership through management agreements. Traore rejected it without drama. He didn't need their package. He needed their compliance. And that was the moment the bargaining balance finally shifted. Because when the state refuses to be seduced by promises, the only remaining option is to accept the new rules or leave. Leaving is expensive. Accepting is profitable, just less profitable than before. Traore had accomplished something rare. He had made exploitation less profitable. Now, the final question was no longer whether the law could survive pressure. It was whether the law could become a foundation, an industrial identity that outlived the fight. Because if it did, the country would stop being a mine. It would become a maker. Traore didn't sign the resource sovereignty law because he wanted applause. He signed it because he understood the cruel mathematics of raw export. If you only sell what you dig, you will always buy what you need at a premium. You export wealth cheap, you import value expensive, and the gap becomes your dependency. That dependency isn't an accident. It's a design that keeps countries rich in minerals and poor in industry, so contracts stay profitable and sovereignty stays negotiable. Traore refused that design. He didn't call it ideology. He called it development logic. A nation that processes its resources builds jobs. A nation that builds jobs builds skills. A nation that builds skills builds factories. A nation that builds factories builds options. And options are what break leverage. That is why the backlash was so immediate. The system wasn't offended by a law on paper. It was threatened by a country trying to climb the value chain. Because the value chain is where the real power lives. When Traore demanded domestic processing, he didn't just cut margins. He disrupted a habit. The habit of treating Burkina Faso as a supplier, not a producer. He also exposed a truth people rarely say out loud. Investment is not always development. Sometimes, investment is extraction with nicer branding. A refinery proposal without binding deadlines is not development. Training without guaranteed hiring is not development. A package that keeps pricing power offshore is not development. Traore refused promises without teeth. He demanded commitments that could be measured. That discipline mattered because it transformed the battle. It wasn't Traore versus corporations. It was a country versus a contract culture. A culture that expects enforcement to be negotiable. A culture that expects deadlines to drift. A culture that expects leaders to soften under pressure. Traore didn't soften. He built endurance. He removed blackmail by creating alternatives. He protected workers from being used as hostages. He stabilized mining communities so corporate slowdowns couldn't become political weapons. He kept the state's posture predictable because predictability is what turns policy into a new baseline. And slowly, the law stopped being a headline. It became a direction. That shift is everything, because exploitation survives on confusion and fatigue. If people stop paying attention, the old loopholes return. The old intermediaries reappear. The law becomes symbolic. Traore understood that risk, so he made the law visible. He made compliance measurable. He made delay tactics costly. He made it harder to forget why the law existed. And in doing so, he changed what people were willing to accept as normal. They began asking a different question. If our resources are worth billions, why do our communities still feel poor? That question is the beginning of sovereignty, because it forces a society to look past contracts and into outcomes. In the end, Traore wasn't trying to win a public relations fight, he was trying to win a future. A future where Burkina Faso doesn't just export rocks and import dependence. A future where wealth stays long enough to become industry. A future where resources don't only enrich shareholders, they build citizens. And that is why he held the line, because he knew this was the decisive moment. Either the resources feed the people, or they feed the contracts. Traore chose the people. If you want the next chapter as this hidden bargaining war continues, subscribe, share, and comment one word: value.